At dawn, the harbor's storage shed revealed the body of the debt collector. His golden watch was still warm, pulsing as if alive, its hands spinning backward, not counting minutes, but the lives of those who owed him. When the watch was opened, there were no gears, only carefully coiled strips of human skin, etched with symbols marking the last moments of someone's life. Now the spirals writhe, forming new shapes, new victims the watch has already chosen. Who will hold it next? And can anyone ever stop the counting? The body of the collector lay crumpled on the splintered floor of the storage shed behind the port, discovered in the first pale light of dawn by a dockworker who had merely come to retrieve a coil of rope. The sight of him, stiffened into an unnatural angle as though pulled backward by invisible hands, sent a tremor through the harbor long before anyone dared voice what they felt. Something was wrong with the stillness around him, wrong with the way the air seemed heavier in the shed, wrong with the faint metallic odor that clung not to death, but to something more deliberate. His belt still clasped the weighty golden watch that had been the source of so many rumors, its warm sheen catching the weak morning light with an almost living shimmer. When the dockworker touched the case, expecting the coolness of metal, a soft heat pulsed beneath his fingertips as though the watch retained the echo of a fading heartbeat. It was then that the others arrived, summoned by the hurried murmurs that traveled faster than any shouted alarm. They gathered at the doorway, hesitant to cross the threshold, as if the narrow shed concealed more than a corpse. The collector's boots seemed rooted to the dusty floor, toes pointed outward, buckle straps cut into the fabric of his trousers, and his expression frozen not in terror, but in a kind of startled recognition, as though he had glimpsed a final truth he had long feared to acknowledge. His fingers curled near the watch but stopped inches short, stiffened mid-motion, as if he had reached for it in his last moment and then reconsidered too late. Witnesses swore that earlier, during the final breaths that rattled faintly through the cracks of the wooden walls, the hands of the watch had spun backward, not swiftly, not erratically, but in deliberate tightening spirals. They claimed the movement had slowed with each of his faltering inhales, as though the timepiece were drinking him in, counting down not moments, but something deeper, older, and far less negotiable. By the time his breath failed entirely, the hand stopped on a point so unfamiliar, so devoid of meaning, that even the most seasoned clockmaker at the harbor refused to interpret it. It was not an hour, not a minute, not even a symbolic gesture toward chronology. It was an absence, a mark that should not have existed. Word spread as the day warmed, threading through the market stalls, drifting between ship masts, carried by the sharp tang of sea wind. The murmurs grew bolder, embellished perhaps, but rooted in a single shared certainty. The watch had not recorded the collector's death. It had consumed it. It had fastened itself to him for years, feeding quietly, patiently, until the final moment when whatever bound them snapped and left his body empty, as if hollowed from the inside out. And beneath the rising sun, the harbor seemed to hold its breath, aware that the watch, still warm to the touch, had merely paused, not completed its task. The unease that had haunted the harbor's debtors did not fade after the collector's death. Instead, it seemed to seep deeper into the wooden beams of the docks and coil beneath the stones of the narrow streets, as though something left behind continued to stalk them long after the man himself had stiffened into silence. Those who had once avoided his gaze with the wary guilt of the indebted now found themselves avoiding their own shadows, uncertain whether the trembling outlines that trailed them belonged entirely to their bodies. The air itself carried a faint chill, not sharp enough to raise suspicion among strangers, but unmistakable to those who had known the collector's presence too well. It crept along their spines like the brush of fingertips, a touch cold enough to sting yet light enough to deny, leaving behind a residue of dread that clung to them through the day and followed them into restless sleep. Many recalled how, during his lifetime, he moved with an unnatural quietness, gliding through the busy docks with a patience that made his steps almost soundless. His arrival was felt rather than heard, a shift in the air pressure, a sudden prickling under the skin, a sensation like someone breathing lightly against the back of the neck. He never hurried, never raised his voice, and never needed to. His calmness was a weight heavier than any threat, heavy enough that even those who did not owe him a coin felt compelled to look away when he passed. They described the impression of something behind him, a lengthening darkness that trailed his heels even under a clear sun. Some swore its edges rippled like cloth caught in a tide. Others whispered that the shadows sometimes split, forming two silhouettes when he stood still, both rooted to his boots yet drifting in opposite directions, hungrily searching the cracks between the stones. These whispers had once been dismissed as the exaggerations of men frightened of their own debts, but after the collector's body was found, the memories resurfaced with renewed sharpness, as though the truth had always been wedged between their ribs, waiting for permission to surface. One fisherman confessed that on the morning after he had begged for a few additional days to repay a loan, he found 3 thin scratches along the inside of his wrist, delicate, almost thoughtful lines, arranged in a deliberate pattern like crude script. At first he assumed he had scraped himself hauling nets, but the marks did not sting as wounds should. Instead, they pulsed with a faint, unnatural warmth that did not fade until he hurried to find the collector and promise immediate repayment. The warmth vanished as he spoke, evaporating into the cold air near the collector's coat, and he never missed a deadline again. Another debtor, a seamstress who worked in a cramped attic overlooking the main square, remembered waking one winter morning unable to move her hand. When she forced her fingers open, she discovered a fresh row of parallel scratches across her palm, thin as the strokes of a quill dipped in dust. The marks tingled with an almost electric hum until she delivered her overdue payment that same afternoon. Years later, she still felt the echo of that hum whenever she passed the place where the storage shed had once stood, even though the structure had been torn down and burned after the discovery of the collector's body. These occurrences did not cease with his death. Instead, the sensations grew sharper, as though the force that had once accompanied him had now been freed from the burden of a physical host. In the mornings following his burial, several former debtors awoke to find new scratches decorating their arms, forming shapes they refused to describe aloud. Some felt a chill sweeping across their skin as they walked past the harbor's edge, a coldness that seemed to understand their heartbeat and match its rhythm, pulsing with a slow repetition like clockwork. Others heard faint rustlings in empty rooms, the soft scraping of something small and persistent, a sound too deliberate to be the settling of old wood. The eastern wind, which once brought the scent of brine and wet rope, now carried a faint metallic tang reminiscent of the watch itself. The breeze that rippled through the market stalls felt like breath exhaled from something unseen, brushing against exposed skin with a tenderness that bordered on menace. Those who had once felt shame or irritation in the collector's presence now felt only dread, a dread sharpened by the knowledge that whatever had trailed him had not died with him. It lingered, patient and watchful, left behind like an unpaid balance carved into the very air. At twilight, the narrow streets twisted in unsettling ways. Shadows stretched farther than light should allow, bending at odd angles as if pulled by something just out of view. Former debtors avoided walking alone at dusk, for too many had reported seeing the edges of their own shadows ripple as though a second outline had merged with their own. Some swore that when they stood perfectly still, their shadows trembled faintly on the cobblestones, shivering as if reacting to a distant vibration. At first they blamed the uneven glow of gas lamps, but soon the phenomenon appeared even under the steady amber wash of lanterns held in trembling hands. There was a stevedore who claimed that one night he glimpsed, just for an instant, the shadow of the collector himself standing at the end of an empty pier, coat hanging limply, posture familiar, though no physical form accompanied the silhouette. The stevedore fled and refused to return to work until morning light stretched safely across the water. Another man, a coal worker known for his pragmatism, insisted he saw the collector's elongated shadow glide across the hull of a docked ship, skimming the blackened timbers as smoothly as a hand running along fabric. Yet the deck was empty, and the night was still. Fear grew heavier with each passing day, like silt building at the bottom of a channel. Those who had owed the collector money began gathering at taverns, whispering feverishly about the marks on their skin and the strange behavior of light around them. They kept their sleeves rolled down and their hands clenched tightly, hiding the scratches they refused to acknowledge in public. None could shake the sensation that the collector's absence was merely physical, that something more essential had remained behind, something that had always been separate from the man, but bound to him for reasons no one dared guess. Even those who had never owed him anything began feeling the shift in the atmosphere. Market vendors grew quiet near sunset, extinguishing their lamps early and locking their stalls with hurried motions. Sailors paused before descending into the lower decks, sensing an unfamiliar heaviness in the air, as though the harbor itself remembered every transaction ever made within its reach. The city seemed aware of a debt unpaid. And throughout it all, the eastern wind continued its restless passage, brushing against wrists, throats, and the napes of necks, stirring the faint tingling marks that had long outlived the collector. It carried with it a reminder that something had not been resolved, something the watch had measured with a hunger sharper than any blade, something that was still searching, still counting, and still waiting for what it believed was owed. The coroner waited until the harbor sank into the muted hush of late evening before daring to touch the watch again. Throughout the day, he had felt its presence pressing against the back of his thoughts like a fingertip tapping on glass, a steady insistence he could neither ignore nor fully understand. He had locked it inside a wooden cabinet reinforced with iron bands, yet every time he passed the room, an uncanny warmth seeped through the door as though the object were breathing in the stale air and exhaling something colder. By the time dusk blurred into the deeper shades of night, he could no longer delay the task that had settled upon him with the weight of inevitability. He lit a single lamp, shielding its flame with his palm until it steadied, and placed the watch upon the table. The metal glowed faintly, its sheen dampened by the flickering light, and the coroner felt a tightening sensation in his throat as though the room had grown too small for his breath. Daylight would not help him. He had attempted opening the watch earlier, only for the morning sun to dim inexplicably around its edges, withdrawing like a living creature retreating from something it instinctively feared. Now, under the trembling lamplight, the shadows shifted uneasily on the walls, forming long, wavering shapes that slithered away from the table. The coroner positioned his tools with the precision of a man performing surgery on a patient whose heart had not yet been stilled. His fingers trembled, though not from age, and he pressed them against the cool wooden surface to steady himself before lifting the tiny blade designed to pry open delicate mechanisms. The first touch of metal to metal sent a faint tremor through the watch, not unlike the shiver of a creature waking from uneasy slumber. The coroner froze, listening, but heard nothing except the soft hiss of the lamp's flame thinning in the draft of his own breath. He slid the blade again, applying pressure, and the case responded with a low, reluctant sigh, as though some unseen force strained against the intrusion. The air thickened, warming despite the chill that crept across the coroner's spine. He pushed harder, and with a subtle, sickening shift, the case split open, revealing not the familiar gleam of brass and steel but a darkness so dense it seemed to swallow the lamplight whole. For a heartbeat, one of his, not the watch's, he saw nothing. Then the shadows parted, unveiling the spirals. They were wound with the meticulous care of a calligrapher's hand, each layer wrapped in precise alignment, forming a coiled vortex of pale, supple material. Human skin. Not old, not dried, but disturbingly fresh in texture, as though preserved in a state that defied decay. The coroner's stomach clenched, but his eyes remained fixed, drawn by the terrible fascination of something crafted with a purpose he could neither name nor deny. Each strip bore markings so fine they appeared at first to be the natural grains of flesh. But when he leaned closer, the symbols twisted into focus, tiny etchings that curled in upon themselves like miniature storms, frozen mid-whirl. They moved, or seemed to move, shifting subtly at the edge of vision as though reacting to the lamplight or to the rhythm of his breath. He felt a prickling on his wrists, a faint echo of the scratches that so many debtors had described, though no marks appeared on his skin. He was not the watch's debtor, he reminded himself. Yet the thought offered no comfort, for he sensed that the object made its own judgments, measured its own accounts, and kept its own merciless ledger. Moments, not minutes. The realization struck him with a clarity that blurred his surroundings. These strips were not remnants of flesh removed at random. They were pieces of time, harvested from those who had crossed the collector's path with fear in their throats and obligations pressing upon their shoulders. Time taken in increments no mortal instrument could record. Moments of desperation, of pleading, of breaths drawn too sharply or too late, captured, carved away, and folded into the spirals that now pulsed softly inside the open watch. The coroner reached out with trembling fingers, compelled by a mixture of horror and scientific curiosity. The moment his skin hovered above the spirals, the etched symbols shifted, aligning into a pattern that seemed to respond uniquely to him. He recoiled, knocking against the chair, and the lamplight wavered violently, throwing distorted shadows across the walls. For an instant, the darkness in the watch appeared to swell, as though inhaling. The spirals flexed, their edges tightening like muscles contracting under unseen strain. He forced himself to lean closer again, driven by the dreadful knowledge that once opened, the watch would not allow ignorance to remain. He realized that the spirals formed more than mere patterns. They mapped something, chronologies of human fear, perhaps, or the precise sequence of heartbeats between a promise made and a promise broken. The skin strips glimmered faintly, reflecting the lamplight with a sheen too subtle to be natural, and the coroner understood that they were not merely stolen fragments, but preserved with an intention bordering on reverence. This was not a mechanism of metal and springs. It was an archive. He could not fathom how many pieces lay coiled within the tiny chamber, but the depth of the spirals seemed impossible. The watch was no thicker than any ordinary timepiece, yet layer upon layer disappeared into a darkness he could not penetrate, as though the interior stretched downward into some impossible space. Each strip represented a life tethered by fear, a life from which the watch had consumed small but vital increments until its hunger reached a threshold. What happened when that threshold was crossed? He had seen the collector's body, the unnatural angle of his limbs, the hollowed stiffness of his features. The watch had not stopped when he died. It had paused. A soft whispering began to swell in the room, though no wind stirred. It came from the direction of the watch, a faint rustling like the turning of pages. The spirals quivered, and the symbols shimmered. The whisper swelled into a rhythm, too regular to be random, too steady to be anything but intentional. A heartbeat. Not his own, for his pulse hammered wildly in his throat. Not the collector's, for that life had already been drained beyond retrieval. It was the heartbeat of the moments themselves, bound into the spirals, trapped in a cycle of eternal repetition. The lamplight dimmed once more, shrinking into a thin, trembling glow that barely reached the edges of the table. The coroner felt the pressure of unseen eyes, not malevolent but expectant, as though the watch awaited acknowledgement from him. He resisted the urge to close the case, sensing that forcing it shut would provoke a reaction he might not survive. Instead, he studied the deepest visible layers, tracing their alignment, searching for any semblance of order. He found none. Or rather, he found an order so alien it defied any interpretation he could name. The spirals were not arranged by chronology or by the individuals from whom they had been taken. They were arranged by intensity, by the depth of fear in each stolen instant. Some strips bore symbols that throbbed with unbearable tension, while others shimmered faintly, holding sorrow instead of panic. Together, they formed a constellation of human emotion pressed into a physical form, each moment preserved with a devotion that bordered on worship. The coroner understood then why daylight recoiled from the watch. This was not an ordinary artifact. It was a vessel of lives, of borrowed breaths and severed seconds, collected with purpose and guarded with hunger. It was older than the collector, older than the debts that had passed through his hands, older perhaps than the harbor itself. And now it was awake. A restlessness unlike anything the city had known settled over Odessa in the days following the coroner's examination, descending first as a faint, nameless discomfort and then thickening into a tension that threaded itself through every street and alleyway. What began as unease soon became a constant companion, clinging to the air like damp salt and slipping beneath the skin of all who lived and worked near the harbor. People found themselves waking in the middle of the night, convinced that someone stood just beyond the edges of their vision. The sensation dissolved when they lit a lamp, but the memory of it lingered like the aftertaste of iron on the tongue. Conversations grew quieter. Doors were shut earlier. Lamps were lit not for comfort, but for defiance. Sailors returning from the outer waters were the first to notice the shift in the tides. They whispered of currents that resisted the pull of the moon, drawing their ships sideways toward the shadowed spaces beneath the piers rather than following the predictable cycle of rise and fall that had guided mariners for generations. Some claimed the water throbbed faintly before dawn, swelling in unnatural pulses that rolled beneath the hulls with the steady insistence of a creature stirring in its sleep. They described ripples that traveled not outward from the shore, but inward, converging as if summoned by a silent command. One seasoned navigator insisted he felt the sea breathe beneath his boat, exhaling warmth in the dead of night and inhaling the cold from the surrounding waves. When he told this to his crew, none laughed. They had felt it too. The streets near the coroner's office grew barren. Children who once darted across the cobblestones in lively clusters now refused to pass within sight of the shuttered windows, their faces paling the moment the ticking reached their ears. Adults dismissed their fears at first, claiming that children were prone to imagination, but even those who scoffed at superstition found themselves hesitating before walking the same route. The ticking, faint yet piercing, did not behave like any ordinary mechanism. It skipped no beats, faltered at no moment, but maintained an impossibly steady rhythm, a constant pulse that seemed to synchronize with the breath of the wind. It grew neither louder nor softer. It simply persisted, following those who ventured too close and lingering in their ears long after they retreated to safer streets. At night, when the city's lamps flickered in the cool breeze, the ticking spread farther, threading through the narrow alleys like a thin metallic vein. Some residents swore it was accompanied by a soft dragging sound, like fabric brushing against stone or the faint rasp of something small moving against its will. Others lay awake listening to it seep through their shutters, marking each second with unwavering precision until the cadence burrowed into their dreams. A few tried to drown it out with music, but instruments sounded thin and wrong, as though the strings had absorbed the same unease that plagued the city. The ticking always returned, always found them, always continued. Even the gulls, creatures usually indifferent to the worries of men, betrayed a primal discomfort. They circled higher above the harbor, wheeling in tight, frantic spirals rather than swooping low to scavenge along the docks. Their cries grew sharp and clipped, carrying an uneasy vibrato that set people's teeth on edge. Some birds vanished entirely, and their absence was felt like a missing heartbeat in the familiar rhythm of daily life. Those that remained perched along distant rooftops, gazing toward the coroner's office with a stillness that bordered on reverence or fear, their wings tucked tightly at their sides. In the markets, vendors whispered that even the air had changed. It carried a faint metallic scent, like old coins warmed by a nervous palm, mingling with the smell of fish and tar in ways that felt subtly wrong. Customers lingered less, casting wary glances at the shifting shadows beneath the awnings. Some muttered about seeing glimmers of movement near the corners of their vision, shapes too quick and small to fully perceive, but unmistakably present. When they turned, nothing waited behind them, yet the sensation of being watched persisted, tightening invisibly around the ribs. The restlessness seeped upward from the harbor into the higher districts of Odessa, though those farther from the water claimed they felt only the faintest echo. But it was enough. People walked faster. Doors shut with greater force. Windows were checked twice, then checked again. The city seemed to be exhaling less with each passing day, hoarding its breath as though bracing for an impact no one could name. The sense of waiting settled across Odessa like a second sky, heavy, breathless, unmoving. A few men who had worked closely with the collector reported waking with the distinct sensation that someone had stood beside their bed through the night. One described feeling a faint warmth on his wrist, as if fingers had rested there long enough to leave heat imprinted on his skin. Another claimed he heard a whisper, so close to his ear that he felt the vibration of it, though the words dissolved the moment he opened his eyes. None of them spoke loudly about these experiences. They shared them only in passing, voices hushed, glancing over their shoulders as though the confessions themselves invited attention from something listening in the walls. The coroner's office became a point of silent dread. People avoided looking directly at its windows, choosing instead to cross streets preemptively, even if it meant wading through mud or navigating the uneven stones near the old tobacco shop. Those who lived nearby kept their curtains drawn, unwilling to glimpse the faint glow that sometimes emanated from the office after midnight. No one had seen the coroner since the evening he opened the watch. His assistant, a timid man with trembling hands, claimed only that the door to the examination room remained shut and that he had heard faint rustling from within. He refused to enter. Meanwhile, the tide's unnatural pull continued. Boats moored tightly to the pier sometimes shifted sideways during the night, their ropes groaning under the strain of a current moving against the natural order. Fishermen found their nets tangled in strange patterns, knotted in ways that suggested deliberate intention rather than random chance. Some claimed to have seen shapes beneath the water, elongated shadows that glided too smoothly to be fish and too confidently to be debris. Across the city, the sense of counting deepened. People described feeling as though each passing second held more weight than the last, as though time itself were thickening around them. Conversations slowed. Thoughts lingered. Sleep arrived reluctantly and left abruptly. The ticking seemed to weave through every moment, marking the days with a precision that felt ominous rather than orderly. The restlessness did not break. It gathered. It thickened. It swelled like a tide moving against its natural boundary, pushing closer to a threshold that no one could see. And as Odessa moved through that uneasy stretch of time, it became clear that the city was not merely haunted. It was being measured. In the dim hush that followed the coroner's unwelcome discovery, Odessa's unease ripened into something heavier, a presence that felt less like a mood and more like a gaze pressed against the nape of every living neck. The watch, sealed behind lock and key in the deepest room of the coroner's office, became the silent center of the city's dread. Though no lamplight was permitted to fall upon it after that first inspection, its influence seeped outward through walls as though the very mortar had begun to thin. The coroner tried to busy himself with mundane tasks, sorting old reports and wiping tools that needed no cleaning, but his hands trembled in a way he could not hide. The watch had revealed too much, and the weight of understanding pressed upon him like a vice that tightened each time he drew breath. It began with a rustling sound that slipped beneath the crack of the examination room door during the earliest hour before dawn. At first he believed it to be mice or the settling of wooden beams contracting under the cold, yet the rhythm of the noise was too deliberate, too even, too alive. When he finally found the courage to open the door, he discovered the interior thick with a stillness so heavy it settled on his tongue. The watch lay exactly where he had left it on the metal table, but the spirals of skin inside no longer sat in the neat arrangement he had carefully documented. Instead, they curled into shapes that resembled tiny silhouettes, figures bent in postures of pleading, despair, or resignation. Some forms were unmistakable, for he recognized details that corresponded with names etched into old harbor ledgers. One spiraled strip settled into the hunched outline of a man who had taken loans from the collector during a particularly harsh winter when the supply ships had been delayed by storms. Another curled into the sharp angles of a woman who had vanished after missing repeated payments, her absence explained away by the city with the easy shrug of someone accustomed to sudden disappearances. Now their suggestions, recreated in the fragile medium of skin, stared upward without eyes, without mouths, yet conveying a kind of pressure that made the coroner's lungs tighten. It was as though each strip attempted to speak through posture alone. He forced himself to shut the lid and lock the case again, this time securing it not only with the brass key, but with thick ropes tied around the box in increasingly intricate knots. The effort was useless. When he returned the following morning, after a night spent pacing in circles around the dim office, too frightened to sleep, he found the ropes unknotted, the lock undone, and the watch open. A new strip lay inside. It had not been there the day before. He was certain of it, for he had counted each piece with meticulous care, tracing the markings carved into them with a trembling fingertip. The new strip shimmered slightly in the lamplight, glistening not with moisture, but with a freshness that made his skin crawl. Its tiny symbols were more densely etched, their spirals more purposeful, their arrangement unervingly symmetrical. When he leaned closer, he realized the markings formed scenes rather than moments, an hour of time rendered with disquieting clarity. At first he believed it captured the memory of another victim, perhaps one who had hidden from death until the collector found him. But as he followed the etchings from one end of the strip to the other, a cold understanding dawned. The events carved into the flesh did not describe a life already lived. They chronicled his own final waking hour, one that had not yet occurred. His breath ceased. The symbols showed him standing at his own desk, hands trembling over a ledger he had not opened in years. They showed him turning slowly, as though hearing footsteps he could not escape. They showed his lamp falling, rolling across the floor, extinguished by a sudden darkness that swallowed the room. At the strip's end lay a single mark shaped like an unblinking eye, as though the watch itself had become the observer of his destiny. The coroner stumbled backward, nearly toppling a stool, and gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. He tried to tear the strip, but the flesh resisted as though it were not dead matter at all, but held a tension that mimicked living tissue. He spent the next hours in frantic motion, pacing from window to door and back again. He tested every lock twice, then 3 times, convinced that danger pressed against the outside world with invisible fingers. He tried to burn the strip, but the flame recoiled as if repelled by an unseen barrier, flickering wildly and casting shadows that warped across the floor in shapes he dared not interpret. The city outside his shutters throbbed with the same subtle dread that had spread since the watch's opening, but now the rhythm pressed directly against his heart with suffocating insistence. Every breath became a question, every second a countdown. By the time the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the coroner felt the beginning of the hour carved into the new strip. It was not sight or sound that confirmed it, but a pressure, an omnipresent awareness that the watch had begun to measure him. He remained at his desk, unable to summon the will to flee, knowing instinctively that the city offered no sanctuary beyond this room. Even if he ran, the ticking would follow. It had followed others. It had followed the collector himself. The mechanism did not measure time. It measured debt, and now its focus had turned to him. Outside, searchers later reported seeing strange shifts along the port walls as dusk deepened into night. They described the shadows stretching not with the angle of the sun, but with a pulsing rhythm, as though drawn outward by an immense, relentless heartbeat. Some swore the silhouettes rippled like fabric pulled taut by invisible hands. Others claimed they saw a human form dissolve into darkness, swallowed by a narrow passageway that had not existed the day before. Inside the coroner's office, the lamp toppled exactly as the strip had predicted. It rolled across the floor, its flames sputtering into silence. No screams followed, no sounds of struggle, no breaking of glass or frantic footsteps. Only the steady, patient ticking, which neither quickened nor slowed but continued with absolute certainty. When the searchers forced their way inside later that night, they found the room empty. The ropes lay neatly coiled on the table. The box that once held the watch remained sealed, untouched, its lock glinting in the faint moonlight. Yet the air felt thick, as though someone had just exhaled beside them. On the table, beneath the coiled ropes, lay a new strip of skin, still curling softly at its edges as if settling into place. The watch had claimed another hour, and Odessa, holding its breath beneath a deepening sky, felt the weight of an unseen ledger turning its page once more. In the uneasy calm that followed the coroner's disappearance, Odessa drifted through its days with the brittle poise of a city pretending it had not felt something brush against its soul. Fishermen mended their nets with hands that shook only when no one watched. Market vendors lapsed into long silences mid-sentence, their gaze drifting toward the alleys behind the waterfront buildings as if expecting something to emerge. The gulls shrieked higher above the masts, refusing to land near the piers where they had once quarreled over scraps. Even the most skeptical dockworkers, The ones who scoffed at superstition and relied on the logic of tides and timetables found themselves glancing at the shadows that pooled too thickly beneath the mooring posts. Odessa had grown accustomed to storms and famine and the constant reshuffling of faces as ships arrived and departed. But this was different. This felt like the slow breath of something that had learned the city's rhythm and begun to match it. When the watch resurfaced, no trumpet of rumor announced it. It appeared simply and without ceremony, swaying from the belt of a stranger unloading crates from a vessel no one had seen approach. The ship itself seemed unremarkable, its wood weathered in the way that suggested years at sea and its ropes frayed by salt winds. Yet no harbor record noted its arrival. No lighthouse keeper recalled its silhouette crossing the horizon. It existed as though it had materialized from a mist, delivered by currents that obeyed laws older than the moon. The stranger who stepped onto the dock carried no luggage, no papers, no expression that hinted at purpose. He worked alongside the others with calm efficiency, lifting heavy loads with a practiced steadiness that betrayed neither urgency nor fatigue. But the watch on his belt drew every eye. Even from a distance, its golden surface seemed freshly burnished, catching the late morning sun with a glow that did not scatter like ordinary light. Its case rose and fell with a faint, steady pulse, as though breathing against the coarse fabric of the stranger's clothing. It made no sound. Not a tick, not a whir, not even the subtle mechanical whisper of internal movement. Its silence weighed heavier than any clamor. Those who glimpsed it felt a constriction in their chests, a flush of heat behind their ribs, the unmistakable spike of recognition that came not from memory, but from instinct. It was the recognition of a debt, unspoken, inherited, and impossible to settle. The workers nearest the stranger claimed that the air around him thickened slightly, as though the space he occupied resisted dispersing into the wider world. He spoke to no one, yet his presence shaped the flow of bodies on the dock, causing men to step aside without realizing why. Occasionally he paused mid-motion, not to rest but to listen, his head tilted just enough to suggest he heard something faintly beneath the din of cart wheels and gull cries. Those who watched swore his posture aligned with an invisible rhythm pulsing from the watch, a rhythm that seemed to echo in their own bones. By the time the sun reached its zenith, whispers had spread through the waterfront. Some insisted that the stranger's shadow stretched unnaturally long, trailing across the boards like a dark tongue seeking the ankles of those who passed. Others described a subtle discoloration at the edges of the watch's case, like the faintest trace of dried blood that appeared and vanished depending on the angle of the light. No one approached him to ask where he had come from or how he had acquired the watch. The harbor had learned that certain questions were invitations, and invitations could not be rescinded. As dusk approached, the sky bled into a shade no inhabitant of Odessa had witnessed before. It was not the deepening blue of evening, nor the smoky red of a summer sunset. It was a bruised, unsettling hue that seemed to radiate not from the horizon, but from beneath the waves, as if something in the water exhaled light shaped by a different spectrum. The stranger paused in his work and lifted his face toward the shifting tint. The watch on his belt pulsed more visibly, its glow rising and falling with the cadence of a slow heartbeat. The workers who witnessed this felt a tightening in their throats, a raw helplessness that replaced fear with something far more volatile. Anger. Sudden, sharp, uncoiled anger. Not at the stranger, though his presence anchored it. Not even at the watch, though its pulse seemed to provoke it. The anger rose from the marrow of the realization settling upon them with suffocating clarity. The collector had never been the master of the watch. He had been its shell, a vessel worn thin over years of silent feeding. His rise to power, his unsettling influence, his uncanny longevity, none of it had been his own making. The watch had chosen him. It had shaped him. And when his usefulness waned, it had hollowed him out and moved on. The workers understood, in a wordless flood of revelation, that the stranger before them was not its victim. He was its next home. The choice had already been made, long before he stepped onto their shore. The watch had drifted through the city's sphere like a hunter sniffing the air, searching for the next pulse to sink with. Now it had found one. And Odessa, standing beneath that impossible sky, realized with rising fury that there would be no negotiation, no protection, no distance great enough to escape the object's intent. Its cycle had begun anew. The stranger resumed his task as darkness deepened, untroubled by the weight of unseen eyes. With every movement the watch pulsed, subtle yet deliberate, as though consuming the last trace of daylight. And Odessa, bound in the thick, breathless quiet between evening and night, felt the ledger open once more.